After the horrific scenes of the Second World War, the world realized that war could never be the solution to any problem. In the future, to prevent one country from dominating another, organizations like the United Nations were formed. It seemed as though the world might finally be free from war. But no one could have imagined that in the 21st century, a war would break out that no one could stop, no matter how hard they tried. We're talking about the Russia-Ukraine war that has been ongoing for the past 2 years. Even after 143 countries voted against Russia in the United Nations, President Putin didn't stop the invasion of Ukraine. Whether it was economic sanctions from European nations or threats from NATO, nothing could stop Putin's resolve. On one side, superpowers like the US and the UK were threatening Russia to stop the war. And on the other, Putin continued leading the destruction of Ukraine. The world has become divided over Putin. Some see him as an aggressive dictator. Others view him as a progressive and devoted leader of Russia. In fact, there are many people around the world who consider him a great leader. But very few truly know the story of Vladimir Putin's life. Born into a poor family, Putin is known for making decisions without fear or hesitation. Even as a child, he was determined to become a spy. That drive led him to work in the USSR's powerful intelligence agency, the KGB. Later, when his ambitions shifted, he moved into politics and eventually became Russia's longest-serving president. So how did a boy who once dreamed of being a spy rise to become one of the most powerful leaders in the world? Vladimir Putin was born on October 7, 1952, in Leningrad, USSR, known today as St. Petersburg. This was the same city that endured a brutal siege by German forces during World War II, lasting 872 days. During that time, more than 800,000 people were killed, and millions died from starvation and disease. Putin was the youngest of 3 brothers. His father, Spiridonovich Putin, served in the Soviet Navy. His mother, Maria Ivanovna Shelemova, worked in a factory. Tragically, both of Putin's older brothers died before he was born. One passed away in the 1930s, and the other died in 1942 during the wartime famine. His family lived in poverty. Even with both parents working, household expenses were difficult to manage. The entire family lived together in a crumbling shared apartment. The neighborhood was so rough that Putin spent much of his childhood chasing rats away from their home. Leningrad itself was plagued by poverty and misery. Street fights and quarrels were common, and in that environment, a young, ambitious Putin started building himself up mentally and physically. Against his parents' wishes, he began training in judo. Soon, he mastered various skills, including martial arts, wrestling, and horseback riding. Between 1960 and 1968, Putin studied up to 8th grade at a local school in Leningrad. In 1970, he completed his high school education at St. Petersburg High School. According to his teacher, Vera Gurevich, Putin didn't know what he wanted to do for a long time. But anyone could see from his energy and potential that he was destined for something big. Putin wasn't just passionate about sports. He was also interested in reading, particularly the ideologies of Karl Marx and Lenin. Whenever he had free time, he would read or watch movies. One spy movie in particular changed the course of his life. Inspired by it, Putin decided at a young age that he wanted to become a spy. His desire to serve his country was so strong that in 9th grade, he walked into a KGB office and asked for a job. The officers told him he would need a law degree and sent him home. But Putin never forgot that moment. In 1970, he enrolled in the law department of Leningrad State University. From 1970 to 1975, Putin immersed himself in legal studies. And finally, in 1975, at the age of 23, he graduated with a law degree and achieved his childhood dream. He was recruited into the KGB that very same year. The KGB years spying in East Germany. After completing his law degree in 1975, 23-year-old Vladimir Putin joined the KGB, the most powerful and secretive intelligence agency of the USSR. This wasn't just a job for Putin. It was the fulfillment of a childhood dream. For the next 10 years, he worked in his hometown, Leningrad, quietly rising through the ranks. His role was largely administrative, involving counterintelligence and surveillance operations. But Putin was driven and meticulous, qualities that soon got him noticed within the agency. In 1985, the KGB sent him to Dresden, East Germany, under the cover of a German translator. His job was far more than translation. At the time, East Germany was under Soviet influence, while West Germany was aligned with the United States, Britain, and France. The Cold War was still raging, and the Berlin Wall stood tall, dividing the two sides of Germany. The Soviet Union was wary of political uprisings and Western influence. So, alongside the notorious East German secret police, the Stasi, Putin's task was to monitor and suppress political dissent. He became deeply involved in espionage, surveillance, and recruiting agents. He also kept a close watch on NATO's activities and the movements of Western diplomats. Putin's skills and loyalty earned him significant authority. He eventually oversaw who was recruited and who was transferred in the KGB's Dresden office. His work was appreciated in Moscow, but it also revealed a darker side of Cold War intelligence: secrecy, manipulation, and control. By the late 1980s, the political climate in East Germany was rapidly changing. Citizens had grown frustrated with the Soviet occupation and began demanding freedom. Inspired by life in the West, where conditions were far better, thousands began fleeing East Germany. In response, the Soviet Union built the Berlin Wall, a massive structure meant to keep East Germans from escaping. But by 1989, the people had had enough. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. It was one of the most symbolic and powerful moments in modern history. Putin was stationed at the KGB office in Dresden when the wall came down. That night, an angry crowd of protesters surrounded the KGB compound. Sensing danger, Putin requested military support from the nearby Soviet base, but the response shocked him. "We cannot do anything without orders from Moscow." Putin was stunned. The government he had served loyally for years was refusing to protect its own people, even its own agents. With no help coming, Putin faced two choices: run or fight. True to his nature, he stood his ground. He stepped outside and warned the crowd that his men were armed and would open fire if anyone advanced. The crowd hesitated and then dispersed. Putin had saved the building and perhaps his life through sheer nerve. But something changed in him that day. The silence from Moscow was a betrayal. He began to realize that the leaders of the USSR no longer cared about the ideals he had been serving. The incident planted a seed of political ambition in him, one that would grow rapidly in the coming years. Back in the Soviet Union, the situation was deteriorating. President Mikhail Gorbachev had introduced reforms like glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, but they had failed to satisfy the public. In Afghanistan, Soviet forces were defeated by the Mujahideen. The economy was collapsing. People were hungry, angry, and disillusioned. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union officially collapsed. Gorbachev resigned. A superpower had fallen. Just a year before that, in 1990, Vladimir Putin had quietly retired from active KGB duty with the rank of lieutenant colonel and returned to Leningrad. There, he began working in the External Relations Department of Leningrad State University. But this wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning of a much more powerful chapter. It was in Leningrad that he met Anatoly Sobchak, the city's first democratically elected mayor, and the man who would become Putin's political mentor. Sobchak was impressed with Putin's discipline, intelligence, and loyalty, qualities shaped by years in the KGB. He appointed Putin as his advisor. This marked Putin's first real step into politics. And once he took that step, there was no turning back. Entry into politics. From advisor to deputy mayor. By 1990, Vladimir Putin had transitioned from a spy in the shadows to a public servant in the city of Leningrad, which would soon be renamed St. Petersburg after the collapse of the USSR. His appointment as an advisor to Anatoly Sobchak, the city's first democratically elected mayor, marked a major turning point in Putin's life. Sobchak, a former law professor and reformist, had once taught Putin at Leningrad State University. He trusted Putin's loyalty, discipline, and KGB-honed organizational skills, and gave him responsibilities few would entrust to someone so new in politics. Putin proved himself quickly. In 1994, just a few years after joining Sobchak's administration, Putin was promoted to deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. This role gave him real political power for the first time, and he used it decisively. Known for his no-nonsense approach, Putin cracked down on corruption within city administration. He rooted out unethical officials, enforced stricter systems, and began to earn a reputation for being a clean and efficient leader, a rare quality in the unstable political climate of post-Soviet Russia. His time as deputy mayor also gave him something even more important: connections. In these years, Putin began to build a powerful network with Moscow's elite, business tycoons, intelligence veterans, and influential political figures. Many of these relationships would later define his rise on the national stage. But his political ascent hit a bump in 1996, when Sobchak lost the mayoral election. With his mentor out of power, Putin also had to resign. It seemed like his brief run in city politics might be over. But Putin wasn't the kind of man to stay out of power for long. Thanks to the relationships he had cultivated during his time in St. Petersburg, he quickly found a new opportunity, this time in the heart of Russia, Moscow. After moving to the capital, Putin met Valentin Yumashev, the son-in-law of then Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Yumashev was immediately impressed by Putin's sharp mind and cool-headed demeanor. He arranged a meeting between Putin and President Yeltsin, and this meeting would change Putin's life forever. On March 26, 1997, Boris Yeltsin appointed Vladimir Putin as deputy chief of the presidential staff, a high-ranking position that gave Putin a front-row seat to national-level power. At the time, Yeltsin's presidency was plagued by chaos. He was known for excessive drinking and erratic public behavior. Corruption was rampant, and Russia was still struggling to stabilize its economy and government after the Soviet collapse. Putin, in contrast, was calm, structured, and fiercely disciplined. He handled sensitive assignments, managed presidential correspondence, and gained more of Yeltsin's trust with every passing week. Eventually, Putin was promoted to head of the FSB, the successor agency to the KGB, in July 1998. This role put him back in his element: intelligence, security, and surveillance. And once again, he thrived. During this period, Yeltsin's image continued to deteriorate. Scandals, protests, and health issues raised serious concerns about his ability to lead. The Russian public and much of the political class began losing faith in him. But Putin was rising. He had proven his loyalty to Yeltsin. He had no known corruption scandals. He was intelligent, silent, and strategic. Exactly the kind of man Yeltsin needed by his side. And then came the moment that would launch Putin into global politics. On August 9th, 1999, President Yeltsin made a shocking announcement. He appointed Vladimir Putin as the Prime Minister of the Russian Federation. It was one of the most powerful positions in the country. Just 4 months later, on December 31st, 1999, Yeltsin resigned unexpectedly from the presidency and named Vladimir Putin as acting president of Russia. Within a single decade, Putin had gone from being a mid-level KGB officer to the most powerful man in Russia. It was a rise few could have predicted, and even fewer could have stopped. What came next would define the course of modern Russia. Putin's first presidency and the rise of a new Russia. When Vladimir Putin assumed the role of acting president of Russia on December 31st, 1999, the country was in deep crisis. The economy was in shambles. Corruption was widespread, and public trust in the government was near zero. Boris Yeltsin's chaotic leadership had left a void, and Putin stepped in as the man promising order, strength, and revival. In March 2000, just a few months after taking over, Putin ran in the presidential election. His quiet strength, image as a law and order leader, and his role in suppressing the Second Chechen War helped him gain nationwide popularity. He won the election with 53% of the vote, becoming Russia's official president. One of his first goals was to stabilize Russia's economy and government. He promised to rebuild the state's authority, control inflation, and bring law and order to the country. Putin took a hardline stance on corruption. He began reining in oligarchs who had profited heavily during the post-Soviet privatization era. He also centralized power, increasing the federal government's control over Russia's regions. At the same time, Russia's economic conditions began improving, helped in large part by a global surge in oil prices. Since Russia was a major exporter of oil and gas, the rising demand brought massive revenue into the country. As a result, Russia's GDP started growing. Inflation dropped, wages began to rise, poverty started to decline. For many ordinary Russians, the 2000s brought relative prosperity compared to the chaos of the 1990s, and they credited this turnaround to Putin. He also strengthened the military, increased defense budgets, and reasserted Russia's position on the global stage. By 2004, as his first term ended, Putin was more popular than ever. He ran for re-election and won a landslide victory with 71% of the vote. With a second term secured, Putin now held enormous influence, both at home and abroad. But there was a problem. Russia's constitution only allowed a president to serve 2 consecutive terms, which meant Putin couldn't run again in 2008. Yet, rather than stepping back from power, Putin devised a clever plan. In the 2008 elections, he backed his close ally and loyal friend Dmitry Medvedev as the presidential candidate. Thanks to Putin's popularity and support, Medvedev easily won, and in return appointed Putin as prime minister. Putin, though no longer president on paper, remained the most powerful man in Russia. During this time, Medvedev and Putin together passed a constitutional amendment increasing the presidential term from 4 years to 6 years, laying the foundation for Putin's return. And in 2012, as expected, Vladimir Putin ran for president again and won. This time, he had no intention of stepping away again. Putin's 3rd term marked the beginning of a more authoritarian style of governance. He cracked down on dissent, suppressed opposition parties, and tightened control over the media and internet. Still, his popularity remained strong, especially among Russians who believed that Putin had restored the country's dignity after the fall of the Soviet Union. And in 2018, he ran again and won a 4th term as president. With each election, Putin further cemented his power. At this point, he was no longer just a political leader. He had become the face of modern Russia. But his growing power came with growing criticism. Human rights groups and global observers accused him of rigging elections, silencing opponents, and using force to maintain control. Yet despite all this, at home, Vladimir Putin remained widely admired by many Russians. They saw him not as a dictator, but as a protector. A man who brought back order, strength, and pride to a wounded nation. And as global events continued to unfold, Putin's next moves would not only affect Russia, but the entire world. Global power moves and Putin's aggressive foreign policy. By the time Vladimir Putin returned as president in 2012, his ambition was clear. Russia wasn't just to be stabilized. It was to rise again as a global superpower. One of Putin's top priorities was to reassert Russia's influence over the territories that were once part of the Soviet Union, and to challenge what he saw as Western dominance, especially that of the United States and NATO. His strategy was no longer just about internal strength. It was about making the world respect Russia's power once again. In August 2008, just before his return to the presidency, Russia launched a full-scale military invasion of Georgia. This 5-day war resulted in Russia taking control of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, 2 breakaway regions of Georgia. This bold move sent a strong message. Putin would use military force to protect Russian interests in former Soviet states. But that was just the beginning. In 2011, as civil war erupted in Libya, Putin, though technically prime minister, took a strong stance against NATO's intervention and accused the West of overstepping. He began rebuilding Russia's military alliances and strengthening its presence in the Middle East. Then came one of the most shocking moves of Putin's presidency. In 2014, under the pretext of protecting ethnic Russians, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. This was the first time since World War II that a European country had forcibly taken territory from another. The international community reacted with outrage. The European Union and the United States imposed heavy economic sanctions on Russia. Russia was suspended from the G8, reducing its participation in global diplomacy. Tensions with the West reached levels not seen since the Cold War. But domestically, Putin's approval ratings soared. To many Russians, the annexation of Crimea wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of reclaiming what they believed was rightfully theirs. Putin had tapped into a deep nationalistic pride. He portrayed himself as the leader who had brought back lost Russian land, defied the West, and restored honor. And he wasn't done yet. In 2015, Putin made another daring move. He intervened in the Syrian civil war. Russia began conducting airstrikes in Syria, officially to fight ISIS, but in reality, to support the regime of Bashar al-Assad, a longtime Russian ally. This move further expanded Russia's military footprint in the Middle East and gave Putin strategic leverage over Western powers operating in the region. By the end of the decade, it was clear Vladimir Putin had redefined Russia's foreign policy. Under his leadership, Russia was no longer on the defensive. It was taking aggressive. But his aggressive stance didn't just affect foreign nations. It affected people within Russia too. Opposition leaders, activists, and journalists who criticized the Kremlin often faced harassment, imprisonment, or worse. High-profile figures like Alexei Navalny became symbols of resistance, but also victims of Putin's iron-fisted control. Despite growing criticism from international bodies and human rights organizations, Putin continued to enjoy widespread support at home, thanks to a tightly controlled media and a message of Russian greatness. As the world watched, one thing became increasingly clear. Putin wasn't just reshaping Russia's image. He was reshaping the global order, challenging Western supremacy, expanding military influence, and positioning himself as one of the most dominant and controversial leaders of the 21st century. The Ukraine War and Putin's global standoff. By the early 2020s, Vladimir Putin had already reshaped Russia's identity, politically, militarily, and globally. But the boldest and most devastating chapter of his leadership began in 2022. On February 24, 2022, Vladimir Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The world watched in shock as Russian tanks rolled across the border and missiles struck Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Mariupol. Putin claimed the goal was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. But to the rest of the world, it was seen as an unprovoked attack on a sovereign nation. This was not just a military operation. It was a global turning point. Within days, the international community responded with unprecedented unity. The European Union and United States imposed some of the harshest sanctions in modern history. Russia was cut off from the SWIFT banking system. Its foreign reserves were frozen, and hundreds of global companies pulled out of the Russian market. NATO forces mobilized across Eastern Europe, and Ukraine received billions in military aid. But despite this global resistance, Putin didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down. Cities were destroyed, civilian lives were lost, and the world saw war return to Europe in a way not seen since World War II. In Russia, state media portrayed the invasion as a noble fight against Western aggression, while dissenters and anti-war protesters were silenced. Thousands of Russians were arrested for speaking out, and independent media outlets were shut down. Yet Putin's grip remained firm. In September 2022, he escalated the war by announcing a partial mobilization, drafting hundreds of thousands of reservists into the army. Later, he formally annexed 4 regions in eastern and southern Ukraine: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. Even though Russia did not fully control them, the annexations were condemned globally, but Putin used them to further push his narrative that Russia was reclaiming its historical lands. By 2023, the war had caused over 300,000 casualties, millions of refugees, and a major global economic shock, with fuel, food, and inflation crises affecting countries far beyond Europe. Yet, Putin remained defiant. He painted himself as the leader standing up to a Western alliance that, in his eyes, had tried to humiliate Russia for decades. As the war dragged on into 2024 and 2025, a stalemate began to emerge. Despite battlefield losses, Ukraine stood strong with support from NATO and allies. But Russia, with its vast reserves and propaganda machine, refused to retreat. Putin also grew increasingly isolated on the global stage, forming deeper ties with countries like China, Iran, and North Korea, while drifting further from the West. Back home, the Russian economy adapted, shifting trade eastward, promoting self-reliance and rallying nationalist sentiment. But cracks were beginning to show. Sanctions were slowly eroding the economy. Protests and dissident voices, though suppressed, still simmered. And the world questioned, how far would Putin go? Still, his leadership remained unchallenged. By 2025, Putin had amended the Russian constitution, allowing him to stay in power until 2036. He had become not just a man whose childhood dream of becoming a spy had led him to control one of the world's largest countries, to shape global politics, and to challenge the very idea of Western democracy. For better or worse, Vladimir Putin's legacy will not just be written in the Kremlin, but in the trenches of Ukraine, in the halls of NATO, and in the future of international order. Legacy, controversy, and the uncertain future. As of 2025, Vladimir Putin stands not just as Russia's longest-serving leader, but also one of the most controversial and commanding figures in modern global history. To his supporters, he is a patriot, a strongman, the one who brought Russia back from the humiliation of the post-Soviet collapse. Under his leadership, the country saw economic revival, rising global status, and a return to military might. But to his critics, Putin represents authoritarianism, suppression of dissent, and a dangerous ambition to revive imperial power. His track record is filled with bold, often brutal decisions: crushing the Chechen rebellion with overwhelming force, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, involvement in Syrian conflict to support Bashar al-Assad, and finally, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, which changed the modern global order. Beyond foreign policy, Putin's domestic control is unmatched. Independent media silenced. Political opponents jailed, or worse. From billionaire businessmen like Mikhail Khodorkovsky to opposition leaders like Alexei Navalny, Putin's Russia shows no mercy to dissenters. Even global cyber warfare, election interference, and alleged assassinations of critics abroad are linked to Putin's vast intelligence network. Despite international sanctions, condemnation, and isolation, he remains firmly in power. In 2020, constitutional amendments were passed, essentially resetting his term count and allowing him to stay president until 2036. If that happens, Vladimir Putin will have ruled Russia for over 35 years. But what is the future of Russia under Putin? That remains a question no one can answer. The economy is increasingly dependent on China and other Eastern allies. Young Russians are emigrating in growing numbers. The war in Ukraine has drained both resources and morale. But still, Putin's support remains strong in large parts of the country, bolstered by state-controlled media, nationalism, and fear of instability. His legacy is complex, layered with military victories and war crimes, national pride and international outrage, economic growth and political suppression. To some, he is the savior of Russia. To others, a dictator clinging to the past. But one thing is certain: Putin has left an irreversible mark on the 21st century. He may have started as a boy chasing rats in the alleyways of Leningrad, dreaming of becoming a spy, but he rose to command one of the world's most powerful nations. And whether the world sees him as a leader, a tyrant, or a warlord, his story is far from over. From one powerful mind shaping global politics to another transforming the future of artificial intelligence. If you're curious how the co-founder of OpenAI, Sam Altman, went from coding as a teen to building ChatGPT and challenging the world's biggest tech giants, then don't miss our deep dive biography of Sam Altman, streaming now only on Success Story. Tap the link, subscribe, and keep discovering the minds shaping our future.